All right, I got some fun stuff to show you guys today. If you don't know who I am, I'm Cam Figy. I work on Team X at Sitecore. We're like the R&D division. We're working on JSS right now. We've got another fun project to show you guys today. So you might be wondering, with the relatively vague title, what we're actually talking about today. Here's a better title for the conversation: GraphQL all the things. So who knows what GraphQL is? Okay, more of you than I actually thought. Great. So GraphQL is a query language for your API. So it gives you, GraphQL, Facebook made it in 2012, and they open sourced it in 2015. In the last year or so, it's gained an incredible amount of traction because it gives you the ability to run front ends of any kind. Like GraphQL is designed very explicitly for the needs of front ends. And when I say front ends, I don't just mean JavaScript. Most of the tooling for GraphQL and most of the usage of GraphQL is in JavaScript, but it is by no means the only thing that can consume it. Facebook originally made it to power their mobile app, so it's relatively agnostic. You can use PWAs, you can use all sorts of other things, and it has really amazing tooling, like mind-blowingly amazing tooling. The APIs can self-document themselves because they are they're introspectable. So you can query a GraphQL API to get information about what's in the API. It has a typing system, which means that you can reason about the API and give yourself those great tools that I talked about. And there's functionality in there for real-time stuff. So if you've heard of Signaler or something like that, GraphQL subscriptions give you a very similar experience to Signaler, but over GraphQL instead. So let's talk a little bit about GraphQL and its advantages. So I think you'll agree after we look at all this that it's time to give your REST API a rest and take a look at GraphQL. So let's talk a little bit about how GraphQL is different than REST APIs. So the biggest thing is it doesn't overfetch. So if you've used a REST API, unless you have very custom, difficult to use extensions to it, chances are it returns a relatively fixed data set for each endpoint, probably more data than you need half the time if you're using it for a front end, where maybe you've got 6 or 8 components that all depend on the same REST endpoint. 2 of the components maybe just need a title, but maybe the rest of them need 5 or 6 fields. So if you see up on the screen, you've got the example of the content service output from SSC. It gives you that fixed set of like all the fields with a whole bunch of extra data like clone ID that you probably don't actually care about. But in GraphQL, you can write a query that gives you only exactly what you're after. And you specify exactly the fields you want, and you can also do crazy stuff with data relationships. So in a REST API where maybe, say, you want to get a Sitecore item, maybe you want to get its children, maybe you want to know what fields are on its template or something like that, you would need to probably make anywhere between 3 and n requests if you needed to make a request for, like, say, each field data, or a request to the item service for each child, and maybe you have 100 children. Well, making 100 HTTP requests isn't going to fly. But in GraphQL, you can say, hey, I want the children, and you can say, I want to know the child and the name. And all you get back is a JSON array that has only the name in it. You don't get anything extra, so it's extremely bandwidth efficient, and it's very good at handling data relationships like this. GraphQL, as I mentioned earlier, is typed. So unlike most other APIs, there's stuff like Swagger for REST that's not really a standard that gives you some capabilities of documenting stuff. In GraphQL, you can see these screenshots up here. This is a tool that is looking at live API documentation. It's a tool called GraphQL that we'll look at in a minute that will tell you what you can do on an API, what the types of all the fields are, and lets you query them all very, very easily in a super awesome UI. So let's go take a look at that UI. Could you switch to the demo, please? Okay, so this is the Sitecore implementation of GraphQL. So let's start by taking a look at the docs. So in the GraphQL docs, we can browse through everything that you can do in the schema, or we can just go and start writing a query. So if I write a query, I'm just going to hit Control Space. You can't really see, but that's what I'm doing. And it's going to show me exactly what I can do at that spot, just like IntelliSense and Visual Studio. So we're going to write a query, and we're going to write a very simple query. So we're going to make a selection set, is what it's called, when you put it between brackets. And I'm going to hit Control Space again, and it's going to tell me what all the root things I can query in this API. So I got items, sites, templates, I can do content search, and there's some other sample stuff in here. And then you can see the schema and type there at the bottom. That's the introspection. You can query on the number of types in the system. You can query on what the schema is with the hierarchy of types in the graph, because as you might imagine, in GraphQL, your API is a graph. So you've got nodes that are connected to each other. So we're going to query on item, and item being an object also needs a selection set to tell us what we need to get out of the item. And if I hit control space again, you can see we have a whole bunch of stuff that you might expect to get out of an API in Sitecore. And in case anyone's wondering, this is 100% live, running on Sitecore. Like, nothing is faked here. So I'm going to get, say, the ID, and I'm going to get path, and I'm going to run it. So I got the Sitecore root item, I got its ID and path, which is, not particularly impressive, but if we go and do something more interesting, like say I want the children, and maybe I want to know their name and whether they have children of their own. There we go, super easy. There's all the children of the root item. And say maybe I wanted to know on the root item its template, and I wanted to know what fields it had on it. And I run that, and I get the template's own fields for the root, which has no fields, right? So let's go and query an item that actually has fields. So you can also do arguments on the nodes in your graph. So in this case, if you just say item with no arguments, it's like, okay, you must mean the home item. But if you specify a path, which can also be an ID, but in this case we'll use a path, if I could type. So we'll do the same query, but on the Sitecore content home item, and now you can see we get, the traditional GUID that if you're a crazy Sitecore developer like me, you would recognize anywhere, 110D559. And we got a query on that item, and it has no children because it is the home item. It's the default, has no pages yet under it, but it has a title and a text field. So here's the part where it gets really fun. On this item, we'll go take a look at it. So I'm just going to hover over it on my query, and I can go mouse over it and click on it and see it in the docs. So if you want to browse stuff and you're not sure what something is, you can just mouse over it. You can search the schema in the docs. It's really, really powerful and really easy to get into. So we went to item, and there you can see all the fields that we've got on here. But the really interesting part is implementations, because item is an interface. You can have interfaces in your GraphQL types. So there's a whole load of implementations of the item. And you can probably guess where I'm going with this, that if I search the schema for, say, sample item, that we have a type in our GraphQL API that represents the sample item. And we pulled help text out that tells you exactly what it is. It represents the sample item template, and it itself implements an interface for all of its base templates. And if we scroll down here in the fields, it has all the implementations, but it also has the text and the title fields that we just looked at. So here's how to get a hold of that. So you can do what's called a fragment. And you can think of it almost like cast in LINQ or something like that. If the result is of this type, then I want to query it as if it was that type. So if I say on sample item, and again we get IntelliSense on this, and I want to get the title, as you can see now we get the title and the text. But title and text are fields, and so they need selection sets because a field has its own set of values. So I can get the ID, the name, I can get the editable value, I can get the raw value, and I can get info about what those mean. So there's actual documentation in the API of what it is, and when there's something like raw versus editable, there's text that's actually helpful that tells you what you should probably be using. So in this case, we'll just get raw value for each of these. And then we'll run that, and we'll get the title and text out of the home page. Now, the next thing you might be wondering if you've used something like an ORM before is like, great, you've got the strong typing, but what happens when I change the field name? Does it blow something up? Does it run, but then the value comes back as null? Well, the answer to that is because GraphQL is a typed schema language, the answer is it will blow up at the query. So if I add a couple of fields in there, it's going to say there's no value. It's also going to suggest what the field type value that you might be meaning was, and it tends to be pretty good at it. So it will actually blow up on the server if you make a query that's wrong. So it gives you that validation. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that you can do with this. Unfortunately, GraphQL is a subject that I would love to fill your heads with for about 3 hours, but I only have 45 minutes. So I'm going to have to scratch the surface and move on. But this is where you would author your queries, and the place where you would use GraphQL, if that's not clear to you, is like if you're building a JavaScript application or something like that, you would be using this to get data out of Sitecore. This is making HTTP requests to an endpoint. So in that way, it is very similar to REST. If I can actually show you that here in the network tab, if I run this query again, that a GraphQL request, can you guys see that? Is that big enough? That the request is just a JSON post of the query, and you can have variables, and you can do some other crazy stuff with multiple batches in the same query document. But the upshot is that it posts the query off as JSON to the server, and the response, well, it comes back and looks exactly the same as the response you see. We're dumping raw JSON. So it's the same JSON that you'd get if you came back from a REST API. It's just structured in a way that it matches exactly the query that you sent to the GraphQL API. So you can predict exactly what the structure you'll get back in JSON is by just looking at the query, which means that the front-end developer doesn't have to go and look at your API docs to figure out what they're going to get back. If they see their query, they can reason about what the result object's going to look like. And if you look at the schema, you can also see that you can do other reasoning about it, like string, for example, here. If it has an exclamation mark after it, like database, for example, is a string with an exclamation mark after it, that means not null. So it's never going to return a null for that value. But if you say queried an item on a path that didn't exist, you would get null back. And you could reason about that in JavaScript as well, or anything that parses JSON. But JavaScript is the easiest. All right, can you switch back to the slides? So you might be wondering what else we've got to play with. And let's just note that a really perfect match, of course, is JSS and GraphQL, because JSS is a great way to build JavaScript apps against Sitecore, and GraphQL is great at providing data to your front end. So what can we do with that? First, to understand the way that we can use GraphQL with JSS, you kind of have to understand a little bit about JSS. So for the people who maybe haven't seen JSS, I'm going to give you the 2-minute intro to the most core piece of JSS, layout service. So the way that layout service works is it's a REST service that syndicates out the way that Sitecore's layout structure works. So if you've got placeholders with renderings in them that have data source items, layout service is going to give you a JSON representation of those placeholders, components, and their data. And you can take that, and the core aspect of JSS is to take that JSON and give you a programming model that you can easily use to allow you to basically move Sitecore's layouting engine to the client or to server-side rendering in JavaScript. So to understand the way that we can use GraphQL with this, it's important to understand the data that we're getting into JSS in the first place. So there's 2 ways that we can get GraphQL data into JSS. In integrated GraphQL, what we're doing is we're taking the field data that we get back normally that would come from the data source item in layout service, and instead it becomes the result of a GraphQL query. So if I look back here, 1 slide, the fields you can see there with title, text, and body, that would be replaced with the JSON result of a GraphQL query executed integrally to layout service. So you don't need a GraphQL request separate. You could just do it with layout service. And the second way of doing it is more or less connected GraphQL is basically the same way that any JavaScript app would use GraphQL. So your JavaScript app, whether it's using JSS or not, I mean, if you are using JSS, you probably make a layout service request, you get the data back to it, and then you're going to make a GraphQL request to get some additional data that you need to render your layout. If you're not using layout service, you could just cut layout service out of there. JSS or your JavaScript app calls Sitecore GraphQL API directly with HTTP or WebSockets, and it's good to go. So those are the 2 ways that you can do it. Let's go take a look at how we can use that stuff. Could you switch back to demo, please? So here's layout service, and I can show you an example of what's actually going on with connected GraphQL, or integrated GraphQL. So normally, we've got the homepage of, this is the JSS GraphQL sample app. I can show you its front end. This is what it looks like. This one is using integrated GraphQL to render this page. So to get the content for this title and for this text, it is using integrated GraphQL, and then it's listing the children underneath it, which is a secondary integrated GraphQL query. So it's actually making 2 GraphQL queries in a batch off to this API. So if we look at the GraphQL query that we have in our layout service, so here we've got the fields coming back for the title, and here we've got this data attribute, and the data is always the root of a GraphQL query result. So normally it would say, you know, fields title, fields text. In this case it says fields data because it's the result of a GraphQL query, and the data source element there at the root is because we queried a GraphQL endpoint called data source, which is something we introduced for JSS that does data source resolution. And you can also do resolution of things like search-based data sources if you want to do that. So we've got this integrated GraphQL query that replaced fields. And when it renders on the client, so if you notice this is a localhost build, what we're doing is we're running JSS in dev mode, but we're running it connected to Sitecore. So it's making requests to the Sitecore engine. It's not running on Sitecore. The reason why I'm doing that is so that we can actually look at the requests that it's making, because if it runs integrated to Sitecore, the layout service data is provided to it by Sitecore because the JSS app renders at the server side. So there's no direct request to layout service that we could see in the network tab. So that's why we're using the connected mode. So we've got this request that we made to the layout service, which we just looked at, basically the same thing. We are getting the home item on our site. And all of this rendering is going on at the client, and I can show you what is going on with that. So let's take a look. This is Visual Studio Code, and we're going to take a look at this is a React app. So if you are unfamiliar with React, here's a super fast crash course. So on the integrated page, and there's a lot of stuff on here, essentially this is a function that takes what in React terms are called props. It's basically a JavaScript object, and it renders a result based on those props. So it doesn't maintain any internal state. It's a very functional programming type of thing. Here's your props, render the result, and the result should always be the same given the same props. But what's special about it is that those props come from GraphQL, because this ends up getting wrapped by the JSS system, and the JSS system provides this fields object, and the fields object is the result of that fields that we saw in the layout service output. So normally, you would be rendering your component out, if it was normal JSS, like this text here that's rendering out the title field, normally it would be saying something like fields.title. But in this case, because it's GraphQL and there's the structure involved, we say datasource.title.jss. And JSS is a little helper that lets you get the correct stuff to pass into these JSS helper components. So it very much looks the same way as a regular JSS site. It's just rendering off GraphQL, so when you need those advanced data capabilities, you can take advantage of them. And similarly, if we look at the definition for this, so in JSS, you can define the whole site disconnected without a Sitecore instance. So we've got this GraphQL query file. Normally, you'll author a GraphQL query in a file that ends in .graphql. There's a lot of really amazing things that you can do with that by not creating it with dynamic variables. You can do static analysis. There's ESLint plugins that will let you validate it. You can download your GraphQL schema to a file and then pass it into ESLint, and at build time, you can have it tell you if any of your GraphQL stuff has errors. So you can do some really nice CI automation stuff there to ensure that even if somebody does rename a template, that's going to make your build fail because the schema will be wrong and it won't validate your query. And so basically what we do is we import that GraphQL file, and then we just add it onto the definition of this component. So if you're familiar at all with JSS, there's an import process that you can define components like this, run against them without a Sitecore instance, basically mocking everything about Sitecore, and then you can use an import process to say, take everything I've defined and push it into Sitecore. So similarly, you can take this and push it into Sitecore, and that query ends up going into a rendering item, which I can show you. So in our JSS basic app, we've got the integrated page rendering. I'm going to make things a little smaller here and unprotect this item so you can see. And if you scroll down on it, there's a field called GraphQL query. And you can see that we deployed that same query into it, and we can open the query in the experience browser with the variables preset. I mean, we can't tell you what the data source is going to be. You'd have to go look up a data source item yourself to render the data source with. But we can basically go and quickly edit our query. You do have to copy the query back out of here and throw it in the field because there's just limits to exactly how much IPC I can get this stuff to do. But it does let you go and edit it. So here we got the context item. It was already set to the home. And you can see that we're using GraphQL variables here. Variables, if I talked about having a static GraphQL file, variables are the way that you inject essentially the different components into your query dynamically. So in this case, we've got data source and context item. Those are ambient variables that you can just use in a JSS app, and we will set them if you're in the context of a rent.jss component. They'll be set to the data source item, or the data source expression on the layout, and they'll be set on the context item will be set to the ID of the page that we're rendering. And then in connected mode, we can go take a look at this about page. The about page doesn't really look any different, but the about page is making GraphQL requests. So we've got this request here that gets the about layout, but then we've got these other requests here that are going and making GraphQL queries. And the first one there. So here's another example of a great GraphQL thing. Query batching. Normally, if you had to make 7 requests to a REST API, for example, you would have to queue them all up, make 7 HTTP requests. GraphQL as a protocol has support for things like batching because it's a very defined, you pass the query and its parameters and variables in this way, you get the result back as a JSON blob this way. Well, some smart person realized that if you basically queue up queries, and so it sets a timer by default for 20 milliseconds, and queries made within 20 milliseconds get thrown into an array, and you can see the array of 3 queries here, and all the queries go to the server at the same time, 1 request, all the responses come back the same way, and then the client, which in this case we're using Apollo GraphQL client, which is a very commonly used GraphQL client on the JavaScript side, and it basically disambiguates the batch, so you don't even know that batching is going on. You just get the query back as if you'd made any other type of query request. You just get the advantage of 1 HTTP request instead of 3 for pretty much nothing. Like, you don't even have to be aware that's going on. And so what you can see here, this is doing persisted queries, which is an advanced way, but another advanced thing in GraphQL that's bandwidth optimization. Essentially, it's a negotiation protocol where when you make a GraphQL query, the server is sent, it just requests the query by a hash value, an SHA-256 hash value. And the server either comes back, yeah, I know about that, and I executed it, and here's the results, or it says, give me another set of data, or send me the actual query. The advantage is that you never have to send the query more than once to the server, because the server will keep track of it, which means if you write, like a 6 or 10 kilobyte GraphQL query, which is not completely unheard of, you reduce its size posting over the wire to the size of an SHA-256 hash, which is like 75 bytes, something like that, instead of 10K. So it's a lot of bandwidth savings there. There's a lot of really great optimizations that the GraphQL community has been making. And just to be clear, most of the stuff is all GraphQL community driven that we just are taking advantage of. So we got the results back for the the GraphQL query that we made. And you can see we have the same context item and data source. If you remember seeing those from the integrated GraphQL query, we were making those two queries. This is the exact same query, just instead of the results coming back inside of layout service, they're coming back inside of an HTTP request. So the last thing that I want to show you about this app is a fun little demo that we built that shows GraphQL subscriptions. So we built a very simple chat app. It would not scale in real life. All it is basically a simple echo chamber. And I'll say that I'm Cam, and I will say hello there. And I had to build robots because no one's here busy chatting with me. So, you know, we got Akshay. I guess no one else is here because I don't remember what I was supposed to say to trigger something. But I will. I'll show you. I'll show you that if I load up another window of the same thing and not maximize it, so that we can see. I can't type. Sorry, Mike. So you can see that it's working across the fields, and I've now immortalized my terrible typing. But essentially, this is using GraphQL subscriptions. It's main to opening a WebSocket connection to the server, and so it has a real-time channel that it can push and receive messages over, and there's a protocol built on top of GraphQL that runs over WebSockets and lets you push real-time data back and forth. Now, chat is not actually the most exciting thing that we can do with that, although it is cool. And so with that, let's go back to the slides for a minute. So let's put everything together with the last demo. Well, actually, the next to last demo. We built a super unofficial prototype. Please do not take this as anything other than complete pie in the sky example of using a GraphQL-powered database browser. Like if you're familiar with the database browser and Sitecore admin dbbrowser.aspx, it's a super basic way that you can interact with the content tree that is not as advanced as content editor, but it's very fast and is handy for some things like it doesn't validate links before you delete. So if you just want a whole tree of items gone, try the DB browser. If it tells you that the template's in use or something like that. So we built a completely GraphQL-powered database browser. Can you switch back to the demo, please? So here is our GraphQL database browser. This is an Angular 4 app that is entirely powered by GraphQL. It is running separately on a different port, different process, powered by Node from Sitecore, and just making requests to the Sitecore GraphQL APIs. So it is, of course, using cores, if you're familiar with the origin restrictions. And basically, we just built up an app that lets us browse the content tree, and we can load them and get fields, data, and things like that. I can say, why can't you be my friend, Jeremy? And save it. And you can see up here at the top, we got a notification that something was saved. That notification was not something that I asked for on the client. The notification was a GraphQL subscription coming back and telling me that an item had been saved, because I'm subscribed to item saved. This lets us do fun things. For example, if I go into the content editor here, and let's split these windows here so that we can see at the same time. And we'll go to the same home item and collapse the giant editor. So you can see now it says, why can't you be my friend Jeremy? I'm going to change this to say Akshay and save it. And you can see over in the GraphQL window, now it says, why can't you be my friend Akshay? That's because, again, we're subscribed to item saved. We know that you haven't changed that field, so why don't we just update it? But what if I had changed the field? Why can't you be my friend Mike? And say, I want to change it back to Jeremy, because who wants to be Akshay's friend? So I'm going to save it again. And it tells me, hey, you changed this. It knows whether the form fields were dirty or not, and if you've changed a field and somebody else changes the field, it tells you you have to resolve that. So we'll take their changes. And then we'll save it. We'll be all good. And then the field goes back to not being dirty again. So this is just, again, this is nothing official. Don't expect this coming in the product. This was just what cool things can we do with GraphQL subscriptions and real-time data. It's way more than just chat. If you need to have real-time reactivity without a page refresh, take a look at it. You can use it too. You can do some absolutely insane things with this type of stuff. Similarly, like, say I rename an item. Like I'll take home and rename it homes. See, we updated it in the tree on that side because we're subscribed to items being renamed. And if an item's renamed that we have shown in the tree, well, we just update the tree. It's real-time reactivity. It brings a heck of a lot of really nice user experience. So that's what I had for that. Can we switch back to the slides, please? Here's the next great thing. You can make your own of these. This is not something that was built to be just a one-off thing. This is an API framework. So you can define multiple GraphQL endpoints. You can define GraphQL endpoints that act against your data, because a wonderful strength of GraphQL is API aggregation. How many people have worked with, internal REST APIs where there's like 7 REST APIs and they all have totally different schemas and frameworks and don't work very well and are slow? Probably just about everyone, right? Yeah. You can take those and aggregate them into GraphQL. And when you aggregate them into GraphQL, because of the way GraphQL works, if you don't query a field, you don't make those calls. So you can have one schema that lets you call, all that galaxy of 10 backend services that, runs a CRM or runs anything else that you need to expose to your website. Expose it through one schema, and if you don't call the schemas that make you do that GraphQL call, it's not going to call those backend services. So it's very efficient. It doesn't call anything more than it needs to. It's extremely extensible. There's 3 ways that you can primarily go and extend the GraphQL API. You can do schema providers. And a schema provider you can think of as being a segment of a schema. So if you remember seeing the docs browser that we were looking at that had all the types in it, think of being able to define a section of a graph. So you can add, where you saw item as a root query, you could add customer as a root query. You could define types that define what the attributes are in a customer. You could define other relationships. That would come from a schema provider. And then you define graph types. The types directly map up to the types that you see in the documentation. Each of those types is a mapping between a C# class. Think of maybe an existing domain model for an API client you already have, and a GraphQL type. So you can expose a little bit or a lot of it, and you tell it exactly how to resolve the values that you want. And the third and most crazy thing is that you can do schema extenders. A schema extender basically comes after schema providers, and one GraphQL endpoint can run multiple schema providers. And the schema extender comes after them and can mess with the schema. So for example, suppose you had a CRM that had, say, a customer ID field, and you had items in Sitecore that had a customer ID field, and you could extend the item API to let you query a customer field on an item that would know how to take the customer ID field and query the CRM and bring you customer data back from within your item API as if it was 100% native. That's the crazy stuff that you can do with GraphQL. So let's go take a look at that stuff. Could you switch it back to demo, please? Before we hack too much time. So our extenders, now we're getting into C#. So let's take a quick look at a schema provider. And I'm going to try and go fast here because I know people probably have questions. So here is a very simple schema extender. It is a class that extends schema extender. And then you make some queries that change your schema. So in this case, we are finding a GraphQL type called appearance. and we're changing its description to say that it was modified by an extender. In the case down here, we're finding the appearance graph type and knowing that it's an I-complex graph type because we defined the type, so we know what it implements. And then we're extending the fields. In this case, we're setting field descriptions again here, but we could be adding new fields to that type. We could be changing the way that a type resolves stuff. There's all sorts of things that you can do with these. So as a sample of that, let me show you a demo that intentionally won't work because we have no internet access here, but it will demonstrate what we've got. So we have this home item that we were querying on, and we renamed it to homes, so we're going to fix that. And we're going to make sure this query still works. And it does. But in this case, I had an idea. Let's make it so that we can query Azure Cognitive Services on the values of our text fields. So if we take the text value here and we say text analytics, so we've defined a new field on the text field type called text analytics, and we've attached a graph type to it that has key phrases and sentiment. And if I run this, it's not going to work because I'm not on Wi-Fi. And something tells me if I tried to get on Wi-Fi, it still wouldn't work. But it does work, and it shows you what you can do with schema extenders. You could add whatever you wanted onto these item fields and have it work. And I'm hoping that it times out soon because then I can show you what I really want to show you in this demo. So you can see we got text analytics with key phrases and sentiment null. The query still ran, and we still got the data that was resolvable. We still got the title, and we still got the text. But what we did get was errors. So in GraphQL, when you get a response, it will send you errors. GraphQL clients will trap if an error exists, and it will usually throw an exception. But if you can still use the data, it's not a pass-fail. It's not that an error is necessarily a termination of your request. Suppose that you wrote this in such a way that you caught it. If text analytics was unavailable, you could still keep on using your Sitecore data. So it's not just like you get a 500 error and that's it. So it tells you where it was, it tells you the path, it tells you the messages that the exception happened. So you can see that the problem is that we can't see West Central US. For laughs, I'm going to actually get on Wi-Fi and we'll see if we can actually make it work. If I could actually use a mouse correctly. Theoretically, we are on. So maybe it will work, and maybe it won't. Apparently not. Or maybe, nope. Unauthorized. So my API key must have expired. But anyway, the idea of that is that you can write an extender like that, we created a type for text analytics. We extended the item field graph type, specifically the one for text fields, which is the name here, and we told it to add a field called text analytics, which we saw in the schema. And then we created the text analytics graph type, and what the text analytics graph type does, and defining graph types is applicable both for extenders and schema providers, is it maps field, and in this case field is a Sitecore data items field, just the regular old field you'd get out of the API, and it maps it onto a graph type. So the graph type that we would see in the documentation, we give it a name. So text analytics, we give it a description. That's what shows up when you see the help. And we gave it the field called key phrases. And we gave it the field called resolve sentiment. And we gave it a resolver. So when I started GraphQL, resolvers were what confused me the most. So let me show you resolvers. What a resolver is it's just a function. It's a function that gets past the parent context in the graph and the parent result, which in this case is an item because we're in the context of an item. And it returns the result that will be mapped into the graph type. So it would return actually like the field, or it would return even an item for the item resolver. Like, you don't have to do the mapping yourself. It's smart enough to map the results for you. You just return your C# domain object. And in this case, we're doing some heinous stuff with making JSON in a string just to make the API work really quickly because it doesn't have to be perfect. And then we're basically returning the result as a string array. We're not returning a GraphQL array. We're just returning an array of strings. And it knows because I declared the field of sentiment as, or the field of key phrases as a list graph type of string graph type. That basically says I'm returning an array of strings. There's also non-null graph type, which is a never returning null for this. So it's a little bit more loosely typed than you might expect as a C# developer, but you have to keep in mind this came from the JavaScript world, and they're essentially adding a type system into your API. So there's kind of where you can go, and the config is all driven by Sitecore Factory. So if you want to define an endpoint, this is a partial configuration for an endpoint, so this is not the entire config, this is just patching an extender on it. But the idea is that there's Sitecore API GraphQL endpoints. Under there you define endpoints, you tell it what the URL you want the route to respond with is, you set up your security, you can set up performance logging, like you can log down to the single resolver function level how your performance is going. You can add new extenders, you can add new schema providers, whatever you want to do. And it's all very easy to extend based on the Sitecore Factory. So there's a super quick intro to that. Can we go back to the slides, please? So as I said at the beginning, I could talk to you about GraphQL for 3 hours. Alex Sheba here was the first one to get addicted to GraphQL, and then he brought me addicted to GraphQL, and then someone told me the other day that Nick Wesselman now won't shut up about GraphQL. So hopefully after this, you guys will also not shut up about GraphQL. There's a whole lot of things that I didn't have time to cover. We talked a little bit about API aggregation. There's also some really awesome tools for testing. The GraphQL tools NPM package is capable of fully mocking a GraphQL API. So there's a schema definition language for GraphQL, and if you go to a Sitecore GraphQL endpoint, you just go to /schema on the end of it. You can download the file of it, or you can HTTP it from a CI process or something. And it's a file that defines the structure of your schema. You can take that file and combine it with GraphQL tools and have it create basically the lorem ipsum version of your GraphQL endpoint. For running tests with JavaScript, no Sitecore necessary, you just write you can use default resolvers, you can write your own resolvers if you want more realistic looking data. You get a GraphQL API that you can query for unit tests. Damn done. You can also do static analysis with ESLint. I touched on that a little bit with the same schema file and some ESLint configuration. You can take it and have it lint all your GraphQL files. So if you're doing a front-end build for a React app or something like that, and you're doing your GraphQL query statically, then you can do that way. And the last thing is for security reasons, in some high-level production APIs, you may want to whitelist what queries are allowed to be executed, because a GraphQL query is extremely powerful, but that means you can also craft extremely expensive to execute queries. There is a built-in learning whitelist. So if you have, say, a set of integration tests or something that executes every GraphQL query that your site would be doing, and that does not include variables. So basically, you whitelist your statically analyzed queries, and then you can pass whatever variables you want into them, and it's basically like giving you stored procedures that you can execute. And that can be done at build time, and you get a whitelist without having onerous stuff with your developers having to explicitly add things to the whitelist as they dev. You can just have the integration test capture the queries that got executed, and that becomes your whitelist. So that's what I had. And if you were here in 2016 and you have a question, just as a reminder, one does not simply address the elephant in the room. And with that, there's some links and resources. Go ahead.
I think we've got time for just 1 or 2 quick questions, okay, Cam?
Yes, and if you have any more questions, I'll be up here. There's a break after this, so come and bug me.
I just wanted to know, how does GraphQL handle authorization so you don't get the situation where one user can access another user's data?
It depends on how you want to handle authorization and how you write your resolve functions. The GraphQL API itself is just a static API. The content API, for example, because it has a Sitecore security context, respects the context of the user that's being executed with. You can authenticate against it by default either with cookies, the Sitecore auth cookies, or by using a Sitecore Services Client API key. And that API key can be set to impersonate a specific low-privileged user. So if you want to grant access only to very specific parts of the content tree, for example, you can. But in terms of authorization for other stuff, there's a pluggable authorization function that you can authorize however you want, and then it becomes a matter of how you resolve the data from your APIs and how you want to authorize against it. Like you could return an error or something from a resolver if you were not authorized.
Any other questions? Wow. Thanks a lot, Cam.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.